Okay, I think what we're going to do now is move right now into the panel session. So I'd like to invite the panel members to the front of the Hello, can you hear me right? So I speak very closely. Good. Well, first I would like to say to Professor Amy Choi, thank you very much for that fantastic opening address and a really good, I think, scene setter for the day, a broad, comprehensive view of where we are. And I hope that by the end of the day, when we have our closing session, we'll be able to address and look at some of the specific issues that Professor Choi mentioned there. In this session, in this forum, we're actually going to focus very much on learning spaces in higher education and the changes that are occurring and the opportunities that we have in higher education right now. I'm going to move over to the desk so I can change to the next slide. So the focus of this forum is, as I said before, looking at changing learning spaces in higher education. We define learning spaces as both physical spaces and also the virtual spaces or places where students learn. And when we say physical spaces, we're talking about not just the formal spaces, the classrooms, the lecture theatres, the libraries, but all the informal places that students learn, in the corridors, in the Starbucks, in the cafeterias, in the small gardens gathered around the pond or whatever. All of those places are very important, and we need to think about that. And as Professor Choi was saying, the group that's looking at learning spaces, particularly for the new campus, but also in retrofitting the existing campus, the people involved there are looking not only at the formal physical spaces, but also the informal physical spaces. Of course, the virtual spaces where students learn, as Professor Choi is mentioning, that's our new e-learning initiative, particularly at Hong Kong U. We have this new e-learning strategy and a whole new e-learning group that will lead us in our e-learning development. So that's something that we also need to talk about when we're actually talking about learning spaces. As Professor Choi was mentioning, we are in a very exciting and challenging time in higher education in particular, where our environments are changing. We're shifting from a 3 to a 4-year curriculum. It's a new curriculum. At the same time, next year, we're going to have something like 3,500 extra students at this university. Now, we're not unique. The other universities, I know that at the Chinese university, they're also expecting an extra 3,500 students. That's significant, very significant. And we've got both these curriculums running at the same time, the old one finishing and the new one starting. So it's going to be a very challenging and adventurous time. We've got new buildings going up, whole buildings, new faculty buildings, where as those faculties are moved to the new, to their new spaces in the Centennial campus, there will be 3 that will be moving across. The space that's left from those faculties will then be subdivided to the remaining 5 faculties on this campus. So there's going to be a lot of shuffling around. There's going to be a lot of movement where people will move from their existing spaces to become more unitary in terms of where the faculty staff and activities are located in buildings. So this is a very interesting and exciting time for us too, because when we're looking at existing spaces, existing rooms, we're looking at rooms that were designed for teaching and learning, for research, for general gatherings from maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, sometimes even longer than that. And we have an opportunity to rethink those spaces. So that's something that we wanted to address and at least to raise awareness of and discuss in this forum. The other thing which is having a major impact on the physical spaces is, in fact, the changing technologies and the new technologies increasingly which are owned by students in the form of mobile smart devices. I was having a discussion very briefly with Dr. WONG earlier from City University. He's just back from a conference in Singapore where he said that 2/3 of the conference delegates were walking around with their own iPad 2s. 2/3. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I've talked to students who have started to use not only their smartphones but also their iPads to help in their informal learning, and it seems that there is really quite a groundswell of students seeing these technologies as being very important and effective in their studies. So we've got this increase of student ownership of these smart devices. We've got increasingly excellent Wi-Fi, and in Hong Kong it's probably second to none, or there are very few other places in the world that have such good Wi-Fi access, not only within the institutions but also in the streets, out in the community and in the cities. The increase in the popularity of cloud computing as well, where people can upload whatever they're recording directly onto a cloud and then access that from anywhere in the world and link that with other people, is also having a huge impact on the potential for using these technologies in teaching and learning. And there are thousands and thousands of new, often free applications that our students and our teachers have access to. So all of these technologies and practices do need to be taken into account when we're thinking about how we design and use our physical spaces. We don't necessarily need the kind of spaces that we needed 5 years ago. Certainly not the same as we needed 10 years ago. So we need to think about, well, how can we best make use of this opportunity, of this challenge, of this refit, of this new development to suit the new curriculum, but not only for now, but also for the future. So what the forum members are going to do is they're going to talk about case studies, stories from their own institutions, from their own faculties, and with these they will share their experiences, particularly in terms of how they leverage the affordances of new and changing learning spaces. So I'm going to now ask in this kind of order. We're going to start off with Peter from the right, Peter SIDORKO, who is the University Librarian here at Hong Kong U, and then we'll move down the line, and then I will end up by summarising issues that have been discussed, and just mention a TDG project which aims to actually collect a lot of these kinds of case studies before we lead on to discussion. Now, because we have hopefully enough time, everyone's going to talk for up to 5 minutes. After each person has spoken, there will be an opportunity for a couple of quick questions before we move on to the next speaker. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter.
for mentioning the library as a learning space. We've been thinking about doing things differently in our library for some years now, and there are numerous reasons behind that. The last major extension to our main library was just over 20 years ago, so Paul mentioned 20, 30, 40 years of age. It doesn't really cater well in terms of digital technology and user preferences. At our own institution, Professor Choi has mentioned that the Common Core and the 4-year curriculum intertwined and the impact that they're having. Some of the characteristics of the Common Core in particular, if you look at this, communication and collaboration, interdisciplinary inquiry, collaboration, teamwork, and so on. This obviously has an impact on the learning spaces and the way that students will be required to interact in response to the way they're meant to behave in terms of the Common Core. And as a prime learning space on campus, the main library, and in fact all of our libraries, need to be able to respond to the physical demands that students place on our libraries in response to these characteristics expected of them, these attributes. In our own library, in the main library, we've had numerous, we conduct a biennial survey, and I guess one of the major criticisms that we receive is that there is a lack of collaborative space. So even before the Common Core was put into practice, students have been complaining about a lack of spaces where they can work together boisterously and engaged with digital content, making noise and creating things. So in libraries, I guess the impact, one of the biggest impacts has been, apart from locally, the 4-year curriculum and the Common Core, but the whole concept of movement from print to digital has been really not so much an evolution, but I think a revolution. I'll show you a slide in a moment or two that will demonstrate the impact that's had on our library in terms of our spending. And that means that print is not dead. I'm not sure if it's dying, but it's certainly less important than it was 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. Back in the 60s, 70s and 80s, there was a great influx of print volumes into libraries, particularly academic libraries. And to house these takes up great space. So that space was often taken from student learning spaces. So while our student population has grown in 20 years, quite significantly I think, and from memory something like 30%, our physical space has not grown, and the number of spaces has not grown. So we've had to accommodate more books, more students, but with less space to do it. Student preferences and learning styles, I think we're all aware of these, not just being driven by changes in curriculum, but just the fact that they've grown up with digital content and have a different expectation of the way they can access information and utilise it in terms of their study needs and their assessment support. I think in terms of libraries not only provide, if I move to just the second last point here, a place of activity where teaching, learning, meeting and socialising occur, but also cultural activities. And these tend to blend into each other, and students don't necessarily discriminate between one function and another within the library. I think most of you will be aware of this report from JISC, the Joint Information Services Committee from the UK. Just to draw on one or two of these points, I think flexibility is an issue that we in academic libraries have not been very comfortable with. That is, the ability to change the way a space is used within a period or over a period of time, or the fact that a particular space could be used for different things at the same time. In terms of creativity and the opportunity to energise and inspire learners, I think many academic libraries that were built in the 60s, 70s and 80s are really quite dull, and you could show images of bunker-style buildings with very narrow slats of windows that didn't allow light or sunshine to impinge into their collections. This is the slide I mentioned. It shows you the growth over a 10-year period of the amount of money, or the percentage of our budget that we spend on digital content. So back in 2001, we were spending just about 11 or 12% of our budget on digital content. That meant the other 88% was spent on print. This year, we had allocated over 72% of our budget on digital content. That means only 28% is on print. That's having a great impact on the way our collection's evolving, the way students and faculty are accessing information, and the way that we make it available to them. So our library on our third floor, as Professor Choi mentioned, we are doing a renovation. The renovation we're calling it a library commons at this stage. It will be quite different to anything we've had before. It will precede the Centennial Campus Learning Commons by approximately 1 year. So in many ways it will be a test case for us and a learning experience. Although given the cost for this, you cannot afford to make too many mistakes. So we've done as much consultation with students and faculty in terms of the way the spaces should be designed as possible. But you can see here we've got a fairly rigid and traditional approach to a library. You see rows and rows of books or stacks of books, and around the perimeter you can see fairly formal and structured individual and some group spaces, although not that these group spaces would encourage collaborative work because you'd be interrupting your neighbours. Essentially there are two buildings here joined together. And just for impact, this is the design that we're looking at the moment. The construction, or should I say destruction, commenced on Monday of this week, and the project is scheduled to take approximately 3.5 months. But you can instantly see that there's a great difference between the previous layout and the proposed one. We're hoping that, while we've called them different zones, we're hoping that they'll be obvious to users that what is in Zone A is different to what is in Zone B, and therefore behaviours will be different simply by the way the furniture, or the type of furniture that's there, the way it's laid out, the ambience from the lighting and the carpeting, the technology that's there or the technology that's not there, will all tell the students this is what this space is meant for. In terms of flexibility, there is considerable flexibility. I just point out one area in particular, which is this Zone E, this blue area, which we as it's set up at this point, it's set up for student learning in a quiet environment. So most likely this would be set up this way during exam periods or intense study periods. But during other times we could use that area as an art gallery for student exhibitions, for book talks and book launches, and for conferences. In fact, it could hold a conference of this size. We estimate the capacity to be about 150, or we could cut it into 2 seminar rooms of about 75 each. There's been some criticism of academic libraries doing this because it has meant, as I said earlier, the growth in print over the previous 3 decades has been at the expense of seating and spaces. And so libraries have been doing things differently, removing collections to storage. In some cases, because they've been duplicated with other collections, they've actually been destroying them, and I know that sounds completely anarchistic for a librarian to be destroying collections. But 2 examples from Sydney recently this year, where the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales have come under extreme criticism in terms of the changed learning environments that they've created within their libraries, and the way they've gone about making those spaces available, that is at the expense of research collections. So I think the lesson here is that while we're undertaking new spaces, we still need to be conscious of the dinosaurs that was mentioned in the opening address. But that's not to say that a library cannot be for everybody. And we just need to acknowledge that there are going to be different needs. We're in a period of transition, and that this evolution or revolution is just going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think we've got an opportunity to, if anyone's got any questions they would like to raise or points they'd like to comment on Peter's presentation. We have an opportunity now. Yeah. Right.
I'm looking forward to your changes at the library. I think it's a place for informal learning. Students checking out is a great opportunity. I know my personal interaction with the library is usually digital. Is coming online and searching. And I've often been frustrated that I can find books, I can find an article in a journal through Google, and I can't find it in the library's own search. So can you tell me what's been done, or anything about how to improve the search and update it with new techniques, Google style?
Yes.
You're good. You have to get very good.
That's good. Okay. The library did implement almost 3 years ago, a new discovery engine, which we call Encore. And I don't know if you've used that. It's an enhanced library catalogue. We've been less than happy with it. From my point of view, it hasn't delivered what it was expected to deliver. But there are new discovery tools that are on the market now, which we've been assessing over the past 6 months. We've been doing this over a lengthy period because they are enormously costly. But what they do is they provide a single search box which will search all your local content, which includes everything within the library holdings, but also any locally created databases such as our Scholars Hub, but also a wide range of commercial digital products of the electronic journals and databases that we subscribe to, and in a single search box. So we're hoping that will improve the discovery. The reports that we've had so far is that they have been positive. And there are about 4 products on the market. We hope to be implementing one early next year. But it is incredibly important, and showing that we spend so much money on the content that if it's not discoverable, it's just a waste. It does irk me some, though, that while we do spend so much money on digital content, that we have to spend so much money again on a tool to make it discoverable.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one other question.
I have a question. Actually, you were talking about please correct me if I'm wrong, about the Learning Commons as a physical space. Do you have any plans to also to develop Learning Commons in the virtual area, to extend actually the website?
In the digital area?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we are exploring that, and I see the two as complementary. As Professor Choi mentioned, the eLearning group will form. The library will be a fundamental part of that. I think from there we will get some guidance on how to better integrate digitally the content into that e-learning strategy. But at this point, it's still somewhat exploratory. But to some extent, our website provides that, although I do appreciate that it is a fairly static environment that we're providing currently.
Good, thank you very much. I'll just get Peter's. Okay, may I invite Mr. Peter Duffy from PolyU.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's my pleasure to talk to you today for 5 minutes, a little bit about a case study at PolyU. In essence, it deals with these two issues, logistics and learning spaces. In terms of the reference Professor Choi made at the beginning, dinosaurs as people, we have some dinosaurs as spaces. This is a given in most universities. And equally as much, we're faced with some certain challenges in terms of the 4-year curriculum structure, simply being the larger cohort of students. So we're trying to think through, some of these issues, and not so much a space to be redesigned, but a space to be considered as a product, an outcome that is what we want out of these spaces, and an outcome driven by pedagogy, driven by learning. I'm very much a pragmatist, so my 5 minutes will concentrate on what is in essence a very simple sort of solution, but maybe a solution that has to be carefully considered in its implementation. Very simply, this notion of a linked classroom is emerging, I suppose, of the two top points, this notion of lecture capture and video conferencing. Lecture capture, very simply, you'd probably be familiar with this, the recording digitally, as we are being today, of a presentation. And video conferencing being more, I suppose, a synchronous event, one time and place as a consideration. And then the linked classroom really being this concept of a virtual large lecture. Simply speaking, if we're looking at, I suppose, some of these considerations, we have lecturers at the moment looking at freshman seminars. They deliver the freshman seminar to a cohort of 200. In the 4-year curriculum, they will deliver the same seminar to a cohort of 800. These are the numbers that are projected. The bottleneck at PolyU is if you are delivering a lecture to a student cohort of above 300 students, there is one place to book, and that's the Jockey Club auditorium, if you want to do that lecture one time. So many lecturers deliver the same lecture 3 or 4 times. This to me doesn't make much sense. But the logistic reality at the moment, curriculum reality, this is what we're dealing with. So in essence, there's also the other aspects to be considered under this notion of lecture capture, I suppose. And the notion of a lecture, a linked classroom being, for example, a room like today where I'm presenting, being streamed to satellite rooms throughout the campus. This is a simple diagram of our considerations so far that I'll just talk through briefly. The left-hand side would be the main lecture, the lecture room as it would be here, as we are now. Then the satellite rooms could be 1, 2, 3, 6. The satellite room could be students sitting at home. The satellite room could be the lecturer presenting, or a colleague viewing the lecture. Equally as much, in theory, I suppose, the system could be used for a lecturer capturing their lecture, the presentation part, as almost like a recorded moment from their office and sent to students as like a pre-reading before class. And then the time in class is a deeper conversation, less so much a didactic content, but more group work, collaborative activities, active learning. The considerations here, though, are in terms of some transparency of the process. If someone is sort of standing where you are with a lecture, a video camera, there's a certain sense of presence there that is taken away from the moment. If, say, for example, normally I would bring with me the clicker device, I want to be able to move around. I don't want to stand even on the stage. Some of our lecturers would go up amongst the audience, talk to their students and so on. So the key point I draw your attention to here is, I would indicate, but next to where it says the lecturer, this tracking microphone is actually a tracking camera as well. So I would have a lapel microphone here, and the camera would follow me, depending on where I am in the room. This is our goal in terms of setting this up, that the linked classroom is as transparent as possible. Then we're also considering, I suppose, on the satellite room side, well, what happens, do the students misbehave? Do they pay attention as management sort of issues? Or is there a perception from the student that they're still getting value for money? They're paying for their course for some of them. And equally as much, we're thinking through, well, how do you facilitate learning? If you are present in the class and you want to ask me a question, you would raise your hand. I would notice this, obviously, you're physically here. So how do we display this to the lecturer? So we're thinking through these as possibilities. At the moment, our plan is to have a teaching assistant in the satellite room, someone to facilitate some of these interactions. And equally as much, it's a change of behaviour for the person presenting. They need to be aware at certain points to pause, to say, okay, we'll now take questions. Some of the software can also facilitate this learning process. One of the ones we're looking at, Adobe Connect, has a facility on the sort of side menu for you to type questions as you're going. So students, as they increasingly do have mobile devices, they can start to log these questions that would appear for all the satellite rooms to see. So these are some of our considerations, I suppose, at a technology sort of level. As I mentioned, it does help solve very much the limited space issues that we will have. It can reduce the lecturer's workload in terms of the repetition of a lecture over and over. Also, I suppose I'll just go back briefly. I should have mentioned that if the data is going to and from, there's the opportunity to capture it, to keep it, to archive it. Some lecturers would welcome this, some not. Some lecturers actually have, in other case studies we've looked at, asked to capture the lecture for their own personal purposes. They want to look at their presentation style and so on. As I mentioned, I'm a pragmatist, so what I want, if this lecture is captured, that it's usable and used. In terms of Peter's reference, that it's discoverable. So we're looking at systems where it's easily searchable. One we're looking at the moment archives your lecture based on keywords in your PowerPoint slide. So any text that appears in your slide, as a student, I can go in and type these keywords and it will take me to the point in time in that video recording where those keywords have appeared. So this is useful. Maybe I don't want to re-watch the entire lecture. It does also obviously provide opportunities for guest speakers. The cost of international travel still being quite expensive to Hong Kong. We can obviously invite other people, even other people locally in Hong Kong to present. And if the lecture is captured, we also see much benefit for this where students have English as a second language. You can link keywords to a definition database, audio files and so on, and these are all sort of possibilities. And then I suppose that's the teaching perspective. Then there's the technology perspective. And then there's the teaching perspective. I mentioned reduced workload. Okay, I'm a lecturer in my scenario that I've described. I'm giving the same lecture 4 times. That lecture counts 4 times in my workload allocation. If I'm suddenly only giving the lecture once because of this streaming scenario, is my workload reduced so I take on more lectures? We will have a pilot soon in this coming September with 2 cohorts, 2 lecturers. This is one of the first things the lecturer wanted to know in terms of a very practical reality for them. And so there's probably not a one-to-one give here. You know, there's we talk about learning space design today, but there's a learning headspace design that the lecturer has to change in terms of her maybe consideration of approaches here, some adaptation of her style to this new environment. We're also aware in terms of some of the assumptions. In these satellite rooms, will students go to the room with the lecturer or the room without the lecturer? Our colleague raised a scenario from Massey University where students would come to the room without the lecturer. For the scenario he described, in that if it's a large lecture like today, if you're sitting in the back row where Ronald is from VNet, he can probably see me a little bit, my expression, my body language and so on. In the lecture capture room, my face would be on this screen about the size of that screen. Okay, so if you're in the back row, you can see me more clearly. This is the scenario that they describe, but we're testing the waters on this. You know, Hong Kong has its own unique context, its own unique culture. So we're doing a small-scale pilot in September with 2 areas, one from engineering, one from faculty of business. So this is pretty much what we're looking at. The challenges of the 4-year curriculum, the support structure needed from a technology point of view, because similar, if I'm giving my lecture and it's dependent upon the technology, it can't go wrong. You know, it can't, to the satellite rooms, Even if they're physically on the same campus, still great trouble if it falls down. So we're looking at the support that's needed. Then we're looking at the support that's needed for academic staff. Their degree of comfort at a personal sort of level with being captured, and their degree of, I suppose, change of behaviour in terms of the pedagogical structure of their lesson, their delivery. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that presentation. Any questions from the floor at this stage that anyone would like to ask Peter? Okay.
Well, it's just being set up for me onto a website that can I ask you for a quick show of hands? How many of you have been inside a virtual world? Can you just sort of put your hands up and show us? Okay. How many of you have taught inside a virtual world? Well, okay. How many of you have been a learner inside a virtual world? Okay. So only about 4 or 5 and about 3 for teaching. So and it looks about 15 or 20 for actually who've been in one. It is, but
You might want to log in.
I don't think that is.
I think you better log in.
So excuse me a second and let's just... I will possibly do the PowerPoint view said, oh, I'll do that instead if I can't. Yeah. Let me go old school for a little bit, so don't waste time. Can you see the picture from the back? You can? Good. Okay. This is in fact a learning space, not just a picture of anywhere, but it is in fact a learning space inside Second Life. So, my experience in virtual worlds is mostly in Second Life and in an open source version of it called OpenSim. Unlike a lot of my students, I've not been in things like World of Warcraft. I'm actually not a gamer. So I sort of haven't been into those spaces, although I've got friends who teach us, who have been around level 80-something or other, which I believe is quite high. So, and they've been up to 80 and down again, I'm told. So there's a few things I want to get points I want to get across, I guess, is that I personally think that virtual worlds have a sort of niche use. I don't think they're a mainstream thing, but I think they have niche uses. I don't know if you've seen the Gartner hype cycle before. This is the one for emerging technologies from 2010. And if you notice where, by the way, people don't always complete the cycle. Right? Technologies can drop off at any point, so it doesn't mean that you necessarily go through this trajectory and finish it at the end. That doesn't always happen. So public virtual worlds, you can see where they are right now. Proper disillusionment is where Gartner sort of, at least last year, was putting them. Okay, so it's sort of gone through extreme hype down to here. So that's, and I think it probably, whether it will come out, I think it probably will come out the other end. It'll stay there, but there'll be niche uses in there. I don't know if you've seen this before, because this is about learning spaces today. I'll let you read the first one. Although it's not quite on the screen. In the 1940s, I guess. So you can see there are sort of 3 types of influence: adults, parents and teachers, peers, and the environment. And in the 1940s, the environment would have been physical, but I think in the 21st century, our environment is both physical and virtual, or online as well, that impacts and has a great effect on students. And if you go to that website, if you just go to Third Teacher, you can type Google it and go in. They have a sort of list of principles, but under different categories. And under one of the categories, I love this one, which is why I've highlighted it. And I don't know if you can see it at the bottom. It says, everyone can be the designer. And I highlight that because I think virtual worlds, one of the things, the affordances that they have is to bring that to the fore. And we've talked about teachers going from being, the sort of sage on the stage, didactic teaching, the teacher as facilitator. I think in the last sort of 10 or 15 years we've talked more about teachers as designers of learning experiences. But I think now we're also thinking about students as designers of learning experiences as well, of their own learning experiences. And I think that's one of the key sort of affordances for virtual world as a learning space, as well as a learning tool, because they're platforms, they're both spaces and tools inside those spaces. However, this is typically, I don't know if you've seen it, but every university I've ever seen, or college or high school, for that matter, I've seen lots of high schools in virtual worlds too. The first thing they seem to do is to replicate the physical space in the virtual one, right? Which is incredibly depressing, to be truthful, because they've got a physical space. They don't really need it replicating, I don't think. But I guess we start from what we know, is partly that's part of the reason. And if you've really got a distance learning context, maybe there's a good reason for that too. But you can see this is what it was like. This one could actually, the one on the top right, would actually seat a maximum of about 400 people at one time. So I actually have been in one like that, even presented in it, when the teachers were from all over the world, and we had 300 people there, so there was quite a lot. But it's just a waste of a virtual world, to be truthful. I think the space and the affordances. And that's why I put up the, because typically you see sort of PowerPoint presentations in a virtual world. Or sometimes they can be a bit more social, or more discursive, so you've got a discussion at the bottom right, but they're the sort of first typical uses they go. But one of the things I wanted us to think about with virtual space is Amy mentioned this morning, she was talking about the sort of attainment standards of the teachers. And the third level was to sort of move teaching and learning to a different place, right? Not just in, the second step I remember was enhancement, and then the third step is a different place. So this is a different place. Very dark. This is the same picture as the first one, and maybe let me take it back because the first one's brighter in this lecture theatre. So I don't know if that's a little bit clearer. It's the same space. Any idea what this is?
Golly.
Sorry?
Golly.
No, you have to sort of look at this as though it's the top bit is on the side, and it's this. It's a head. Yes, right. This is actually from. This is an English literature professor. This is Macbeth. It's Macbeth's head on the pillow. Okay. And this is not just landscape, this is soundscape. So she's an Australian colleague. Her name is Dr. Angela Thomas. She's now at the University of Tasmania, which is where Mike is going on to, and was at the University of Sydney when she did this. So this is, I think, thinking of the space differently. This is something that you can't do really in a physical world, but you can do it in a virtual. So if you excuse me flashing forward a little bit. So what you can't see, the lighting, is it possible to get the lights off the screen? Because it's not seeable. Yeah, I mean I can't see it, they don't. But what you've got at the bottom there is sort of red ghost figures. And actually when you click on one part of the head, there's some ways going around it, you actually go inside Macbeth's head. And this, if you know the Macbeth play, if you don't, then apologies. But in the Macbeth play, you sort of go into his nightmares that he has. And this is all the ghosts in his nightmares. As an avatar, you even lose your head at one point, is when you get beheaded. So there's all sorts of things that happen to you. And remember the sound going on. This is the one thing I hate about virtual worlds is presenting about them in this sort of way, because I think they're experiential environments, and looking at them on screen is probably about the most awful thing you can do. You need to be there. But to me, this is something that, this project that she did, she teaches students about English literature. This teacher, Angela also actually trained secondary school, high school teachers who teach literature as well. So it was used both with students, undergraduate, postgraduate students, and with teachers who are training the classroom. So they get a very different experience about what teaching and learning can be, I think. I've left some resources here, so if you're interested in other niche uses, this is just English literature. There are lots of disciplines that do it differently. So if you want to send us a link to a friend, also an Australian friend, a different Joe Kay, who's sort of got a lovely website where she gives you the cases of different disciplines that you can go in and see how people have used these more innovatively, if you like, beyond simple replication of campus sort of lectures and things. Okay. One of the big barriers, I think, for virtual worlds, I don't know if people have been in, there's a few. One is technical or technological barrier. You have to have a pretty high-powered computer. Learning the interface is not easy on the whole as a first-time user. And it also, for the people in the university on the tech side, it's awful to support. They do updates on an almost bi-weekly basis, and you know, if you've got these stuck in a lab because the students' computers aren't powerful enough to deal with them, or even if the student does have it on their own computer, they've got to update the darn thing every 2 weeks. So you can almost guarantee you've got to commit to big downloads. So it's a pain. So there's also other barriers, I think, psychological as well. But the technical is a big one. So I think one of the ways that they will become more used, but still a niche use, but more used, is when they're through the web browser. So all of these examples are actually the OpenSim, the open source version of Second Life. So they're all through the browser, different ones. So this is more pointing to where I think these things are going right now. But even more so, I think is interesting about how we might blend the virtual world with the physical world. So I'm not going to show these because we don't have time. But again, you can go here and look at them yourself. Have you heard of Connect? Anybody? Have you heard of Connect? You. So Connect has cameras with it. So it can detect your bodily movement. You know, like a Wii, you've got the hand. Well, this one just detects your bodily movement. So you can actually do things in physical life, and it will control your avatar inside the virtual world. So I can go high, and it will wave to people inside the virtual world, things like that. The right-hand one, this person actually pushes down in real life, hits the plunger, the bomb plunger, and it explodes something. I think it's just to show what it is. This one's even more interesting. They're wearing 3D glasses. So one person is working with the virtual world, and the other person is working with the physical world, and they're collaborating on a design. Okay. So I think those sort of blending of augmented reality, physical, virtual, some people call it cyber-physical, other people call it augmented reality. I think that's another type of space that we're thinking of. How are you blending those learning spaces together? So I think that's partly where the future might be. And at that point, I'm going to stop.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Would anyone like to ask Nick a question at this point on virtual worlds? Brent.
Brent Knudsen from LinkedIn. You mentioned OpenSim. I know PolyU has been doing something with OpenSim as well. Do you have any interest in forming a Hong Kong grid where the university's OpenSim spaces can join up and people can walk virtually from one campus to another?
Maybe they ought to talk about that. I've been experimenting with this. I've shown it to faculty before, but and honestly, in UST, the faculty are not that interested in this right now. They feel the technical barriers. So I think for us, when it comes browser-based and we don't have to do all the updates, they will start to get interested. I mean, I think there's niche uses. So PolyU's, one of its main niche uses to begin with was in the hotel and tourism, School of Hotel and Tourism. And you know, you see people using it for like simulations and that sort of thing. So I think that's where it has a niche use. I think the barriers are so high that it's really, the value has to be very high to be worth the effort invested, not just by the teacher, but by the students as well. It's a lot of, I think, investment of student time. So you know, that's why, like Angela's one, I've shown it, because the value there, you just can't get that value in a physical world, and it's high, and the reaction to it is incredible from the students who go in there. So, you know, you've got to find things where the value, I think, is worth that effort that gets involved. I don't know about a Hong Kong grid, though. Okay.
Just similarly at PolyU, like we have a cohort of users that are using it in OpenSim with Reaction Grid as a wrapper, but still the barriers still are there at the moment, mostly along the lines of what Nick has described. So certainly we welcome the conversation, but we'd have to sort of test the waters with my colleagues.
Great. Yeah, Blake.
Maybe you can provide numbers. How many hours do you think would it take for a teacher who knows nothing about virtual worlds to go from zero to conducting a lesson on top of that test head? I just wonder, it's one thing to be a user of a virtual world, and to even go to the next level to design a learning space such as MetCast Head, and then to design the lesson and the pedagogy to go along with it. I mean, it seems like that's quite intensive as far as professional development.
It is, absolutely. I don't even, the teacher, Angela in this case, Angela Thomas, her pedagogy is already very advanced. So in terms of using technology, in fact, it's partly her research area too. Her research area is social media as well, with youth. But and so she's blending her research with her teaching very, very well. So, but what you just described there is there's different learning to be done here. So there's learning on a technical level, which I gave as one of the main barriers, but not the only barrier. Another barrier you're talking about is what's the pedagogy that is associated with virtual worlds, and how do you move people from replicating the pedagogy they may use in a traditional physical space, and in that physical space. You saw what happened. Most people went in, the first teachers that went in, replicated lectures and discussion, sort of lectures or seminar discussions in the physical space, in the virtual space. But it's moved on a lot forward from that. There's been a lot of work done with like problem-based learning, for example, in virtual worlds. And some good work that I've seen out of the UK that did that with University of I think Leicester and Coventry and some others who did that too. There's some great work as well with high school level use of virtual worlds too. But it's a big learning curve in terms of the pedagogy. In terms of getting students used to it, I have a colleague who's a computer science professor in the States. It only took her 3 hours to get students to use the environment, and they were using it to do rapid prototyping. So they were actually using it to create things and do rapid prototyping quickly in the environment. So the technical learning curve can be quite, the interface and the technology could be quite short if you've got somebody who's very good at taking people through that process hands-on. Right? She didn't sort of teach them about it, she just takes them in there and does it. But the pedagogy one, I think, is a bigger learning.
One final question. Cecilia.
Hi, Nick. There have been increasingly a lot of marketing things on the augmented reality in digital books, right? And it looks absolutely impressive, especially for the children's book. In your own opinion, do you think it's actually useful for pedagogy? Because I've heard a few things like, why don't they just watch video? Right? But it looks impressive, but I'm not sure. What your opinion do you think?
Well, I guess my opinion is more that if you can find learning value in there, learning impact that's worth the effort involved of the people, either the teachers or the students involved, then it's worthwhile doing. When you talked about books, though, you're reminding me that there was the Pearl Report last week in Hong Kong,
yes.
Which you obviously maybe saw. They had some very got some very creative people in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. There was one guy who did an augmented reality book. So the book is on the iPad and passed it so that it uses the camera on the new iPad, passed it over something on the table, and a 3D animation comes out of the picture because of what it's passing across in the real world. So, actually, it passed it across a picture, and out of the picture on the wall came a dinosaur.
Yeah, it's
right?
like
it's a kid's book, but I don't know whether that's not really the idea about the learning impact, but it's more the idea that of blending the physical and the virtual is becoming a very different thing. The Connect one, for example, one company for that one, you can actually put yourself in as an avatar into a virtual world in absolutely seconds. You take one front, because it has cameras, it takes one front shot, one side shot, and within 15 seconds, your avatar of you was in a virtual world. And if you've ever done it in Second Life or OpenSim, people mess around with their avatars for months. Absolutely months. It's the first thing when they've researched it, most people spend months doing is playing around with their avatar until they get it to an appearance that they're happy with, whether it's them or something else. It's not always them. But, and another one they showed was where they actually took a kid's toy and scanned that in. So for young children, and the toy became animated. I mean, it could move and be animated and talk back to you and stuff. So, you could take your own favourite toy as a child and put it into a virtual world, and all of a sudden it's animated. What that means with learning, I'm not too sure right now, but the technology is sort of jumping ahead so fast that, in a sense, do we get engaged by that and then start thinking about, is the learning potential in that or not for it. But it's moving very quickly. I mean, I've got an iPad here now, which, to be truthful, I could have, if we'd set this up, the thing I love about the new technology is that it will make you think about learning spaces differently. So I could have controlled my PowerPoint from here onto the computer or Prezi. But even more importantly, not does it get me off the podium, I could have handed this over to the students in the lecture room and had them doing something. So I think the fact that these things can change power structure in a classroom, that's incredibly important for pedagogy. Right? That's why I said students as designers of learning experiences. That's really the key thing for me, whether it's a virtual world or anything else.
Great, thank you, Nick. That's good, fantastic. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Crosher from City University.